Hello, everybody. My name is Craig Yateman. You're in a WorldView Academy Conversation Café. And today we're dealing with why do we deal poorly with poor performance? We've prepared a short recording to help you transition into the conversation we had with Nevern Subramani, and I'll introduce Nevern in a second. To kick off, we know that dealing with poor performance is a cornerstone of managerial progression. Managers have this responsibility to take care of the performance of their unit or group. And as is a tradition with WorldView Café, we posed this question. Well, first we introduced Nevern Subramani. For those of you who have not seen Nevern in one of our calls, Nevern's a clinical psychologist who's transitioning into organisational work. So he's got all the clinical psych qualifications, and he's currently studying a BCom IO Psych to help him with his transition into, let's say, corporate work. For those of you interested in Nevern's tools and tips from clinical psychology, find him on YouTube as Nevern Subramani, or email him if you love the content that follows and you'd like to talk to Nevern some more. We posed this question to our delegates: how well do managers in your organization or in your experience deal with poor performance, and what seems to be getting in the way of that? And delegates, as usual, went off in small groups and talked about that, and then brought back some of their stories, which I'm going to summarize now, and you'll see Nevern deals with in the content as he presents. Delegates raised questions of process, firstly. So the clearest example was applying the General Electric bell curve and those bottom 10% performers being dismissed. And in the South African context, that ending up in the CCMA with a request to prove, on what empirical basis did you decide that these people were in the bottom 10%? The other problem that delegates raised was deferring this to HR. So line managers kind of abdicating the responsibility to deal with poor performance and expecting HR to deal with it. That gets in the way. Some delegates talked about personality, of course, and just the fact that it's difficult for some people to have those tough conversations. And from a personality point of view, not everybody is suited for this. And then just the fact that it seems to become emotional. Some of our delegates talked about how this invariably gets emotional, and you'll see Nevern dealing with that directly in his tips from psychology. So having put this question to our delegates and taken a bit of feedback from them, which brought the delegates into the conversation, we talked a little bit about the kind of radical approaches to dealing with poor performance. In South Africa today, there was a newspaper article about a minister being fired, and the journalist, Stephen Groothuis, was wondering if there is a positive effect of very visibly a minister being fired for performance issues and whether others might respond to that. And we used the story of Sun Tzu training the imperial concubines. And for those of you who have not heard that story, you can look it up. It's a very interesting and very blunt way of dealing with poor performance. And in summary, Sun Tzu, more than 2,000 years ago, was saying, if the first instructions around performance are not understood, then the person giving the instructions should give them again. Make sure that they're clear and that they're understood. But if the second instructions are not followed, then the responsibility is the manager. And Sun Tzu was talking about it's the fault of their officers, and in the organizational context, that would be the managers. Sun Tzu's solution was to ceremonially execute a couple of the officers in front of everybody, and then he noticed that performance improved significantly after that. We don't think that's a particularly good way of dealing with poor performance, and so we wondered if there were other ways. We also had to deal with the fact that poor performance is not just about the manager. There are structural issues often in poor performance, things that come out of the context, and light examples, national or group culture, or information disparity, or things like power distortions, where people might be reporting into multiple managers or being protected by a senior manager for some reason. And then we set those aside. We said, we're not dealing with those today. We're not going to look at the structural and contextual issues. And we're not going to look at the responsibility of the individual to deal with their own poor performance. Just to give us something to focus on, we're just going to look at why is it that a manager might not address poor performance? What might cause that? And we needed a framework to do that. There are many frameworks in organizational development work, but we chose the trans-theoretical model of change. Now, that is usually trained in clinical settings, and it was useful for us because our guest, Nevern Subramani, is a clinical psychologist, and he would be able to relate to this framework. And we wondered if the problematic behavior was a manager not dealing with poor performance, how might this framework help us think about why and what we could do about that? And you see in the framework these steps. It's a stage model. One thing comes before the other. And we broke that model out into this table. Down the left of the table, you can see the model, pre-contemplation. So that would be when the manager is not aware that there is a performance problem. Contemplation, they're aware and they are now starting to think about dealing with it. Preparation, preparing to engage the employee. Action, engaging with the employee to improve the performance. And then maintenance. And this particular change model talks about the maintenance phase needing to last for 3 to 6 months. So this could be maintenance of the manager themselves, practicing, dealing with poor performance. They're going to have to keep it up for 6 months to become, to make it a normal behavior for them. But of course, there's also the maintenance phase of dealing with an employee's poor performance to make sure that they don't relapse. And what follows is Nevern talking through the psychological processes that you see on the screen, from denial all the way down to limiting beliefs. And he touches very lightly on some of the interventions that you might be able to use to help your managers get better if they're getting stuck at any of these phases. Thank you for joining us on this call, and I'm delighted now to hand you over to Nevern. All right, Nevern, would you like me to keep this screen up, or should I stop sharing while you start to talk this through?
You can keep it up. Thanks, Craig.
Okay, over to you.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to walk you through this model, this trans-theoretical model of change. And this model basically makes you aware that if you're trying to change a specific behavior, there are specific phases that you have to move through. So these phases are not optional, and this applies to any behavior. Originally, the research around this model to describe behavior change was used for addiction. So it was used in the addiction research to understand how someone might quit smoking, how someone might quit binge eating. But eventually, these researchers realized that this model it's such a meta framework that it can apply to any behavior. So today we're going to speak about the behavior change specifically in terms of how does a manager become the kind of manager who engages in the behavior of addressing poor performance. So the behavior here is getting very good and effective and consistent with feedback on poor performance. Now I'm going to help you move from pre-contemplation all the way down past maintenance into termination, and that's when you'll be successful in terms of this behavior. So let's start with the first phase, pre-contemplation. This is the first phase you need to engage. This is the first phase where people are when they're trying to change a behavior. And in this phase, you are pre-contemplating. You're before the contemplation of whether you should even change or not. This is where you're unaware that there's even a problem. And there are two psychological processes here that can get in the way of a manager actually engaging, actually being aware that there are performance issues. Number one is denial. Now, denial is an unconscious psychological process where you're not acknowledging some part of reality. I'm oftentimes in denial about how unhealthy a food is when I'm really craving it. You know, if there's a burger, I think, oh, you know what? It's got some tomato, it's got some lettuce in. The bread has some sesame seeds sprinkled on it. It's kind of fine. It's kind of healthy. In those moments, what's happening to me is I'm unconsciously keeping the truth of the matter from my psyche, that this this burger is probably not good for me. It's probably not that healthy, and I probably shouldn't be eating it. So denial works in our life all the time, but it can work in a manager's life when the manager is denying the poor performance. They're thinking there's no performance issue here. No, everything's fine. Everything's fine. They're kind of keeping keeping their head in the sand, or keeping their hand over their eyes. Now, what's important here is they're not doing this consciously. Remember, by definition, if you're in pre-contemplation phase, you're unaware that there's an issue. So they genuinely don't think there's an issue because it's in the unconscious. So what you need here is objective data. You need external feedback, 360 assessments. You need to get the data from outside your mind because your mind is denying it. So you need something objective when the subjective is failing you. So that's how denial keeps you unaware of performance issues. Now we get to another process that keeps you unaware, which is motivated reasoning. This is when you are, this is when you already believe something and all your reasoning is in favor of that belief. A very, very good example here is, does anyone here ever watch news related to American politics? Is anyone here ever aware? Just let me know in the chat bar. You can just say, give me a yes. I just want an indication if anyone's aware of the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party, things like that. Now, if you watch American politics, you'll see that there are these two. Craig says yes, it's messy. Yeah, very messy, right? So I saw this very interesting video where someone was going to people who supported a conservative candidate and told the conservative candidates about all the horrible things that the liberal candidate has done. And the conservatives were outraged. They were fuming. They were saying, yeah, how can this be? This is exactly why you shouldn't vote for the Liberal Party. And then he reveals later on that it was their candidate who did all of these things. And then in that moment, you can see the motivated reasoning kick in. Oh no, but in that instance, it was false information, or in that instance, there's probably a reason he did that. So in that instant, when they get caught and realize, oops, I've been reacting outraged to what my candidate did, their brain switches their motivated reasoning on, and then they reason in a way that preserves the image of their candidate. And they did this vice versa, right? Liberal candidate and conservative candidate, and both sides do it because they already believe my party is the right party. So this is an example of motivated reasoning. Now with managers, it's going to sometimes happen that the manager already believes that the performance is good. And because of that belief, their motivated reasoning obscures their vision. They're not seeing things clearly. And so a useful strategy there, or form of development, is what's called a decisional balance sheet. It's where you consciously draw up how someone is performing, and then you make a decision. You say, well, what's the pros of engaging in performance management? What's the cons of engaging in it? And then you make a conscious decision so that you can bypass this motivated reasoning, and you only use objective data there. So that's the pre-contemplation phase. Now, if you overcome these processes, you'll move down to that next row, which is contemplation. Now, you are considering the change. You believe that something needs to change. You believe that you need to engage in some performance management, but you're not doing anything about it yet. You're not preparing, you're not planning, you're not scheduling a meeting, you're not engaging in any preparation yet. You just know, okay, I'll admit it. There is a performance issue here and something does need to happen, but you're not preparing yet. Two things that keep you stuck here. Number one is conflict avoidance. Teboho said earlier, people do not want to confront issues. They let it build up, right? And that's the problem with conflict avoidance, is you're only avoiding the conflict now in the short term. what I've seen in my therapy practice, especially in couples, is that people who avoid conflict actually have the worst kind of conflict eventually, the biggest blowouts, because you can only be resentful for so long before the temperature hits 100 and the water boils over. So Tebogo made a very good point there, that in many of these managerial situations, people don't want to confront these issues. They avoid the conflict. Lawrence also said that there's conflict avoidance, but he attributed it to sometimes there's a bit of a mafia-like structure, and it's adaptive to avoid the conflict because you might get hurt. There might be negative consequences. So there's also some conflict avoidance, but there it might be a bit more adaptive because it's a structural issue. Where it's not adaptive is where you're just avoiding conflict all the time, reactively. It's just in your personality, to bring in the topic of personality. That needs to be addressed. So managers who are conflict avoidant might say, if I raise this, they might get upset, so let me keep the peace. And to overcome this, you need to engage in some assertiveness training. If you don't know what assertiveness training is, look it up. There's plenty of resources online. I've created videos about that as well. It basically gives you a script on how to engage conflict situations. What you did made me feel this way, and this is my expectation, etc., etc. Many people who avoid conflict don't know the words to use. Assertiveness training helps you with that. And then sometimes I engage role plays to help the person become more confident in speaking out those scripts. So assertiveness training, very helpful there. But there's something else that can keep you stuck in contemplation, where you know something needs to change, but you're not doing anything about it. And that is experiential avoidance. Now, again, experiential avoidance is where you're avoiding a situation because of how it makes you feel. There's something that it brings up for you in terms of your experience, and you don't like that. Usually it's emotions, specific emotions that come up, and you say, I don't want to go into that situation because if I go there, I'm going to feel this way, and I already kind of feel that way, even just imagining it. So I'm going to avoid the experience. I'm going to avoid that experience. Experiential avoidance is not good. It leads to lower well-being, it leads to lower performance because you're not confronting issues. Tebogo mentioned sometimes there's even this fear of being taken to the CCMA, or if someone feels they were dismissed unfairly, or whatever else. So all those fears are already there that you might be avoiding. And then Lawrence also used the words that these conversations make people uncomfortable. And that is where the discomfort is causing you to avoid the situation. Okay, so in the comment section, if anyone's able to type, please let me know what emotions come up for you most strongly before a tough conversation. It doesn't have to just be manager subordinate. It can even be with your partner, with anyone else. Please flood the chat section right now with something. Give me at least one. I'd like each of you to give me at least one emotion. This is very important because I want you to relate to each other and see what comes up. If it's shared, if it's not, if it's unique. Craig says anxiety and sometimes anger. Yeah, those are very common. But just send those in the chat bar. Richard, oh, great one, Richard. Richard says rejection, right? That's a powerful emotion. That can really influence your behavior. Now, what you want to do with experiential avoidance is, if you're feeling this, like if Craig is feeling the anxiety, if Richard's feeling the rejection, Lawrence is feeling the fear, Charisse is feeling the anxiety and the second guessing, and Dumisani is feeling that fear of confrontation, you have to develop your willingness to lean into emotions. And this is what psychologists oftentimes mean when we say you have to lean into your emotions, you have to accept your emotions. It's not fluffy stuff. Accepting your emotions, leaning into Dumisani's fear of confrontation, or Liesel's feeling of second guessing herself, leaning into that means you become more capable of leaning into the performance conversation. Because if you can't confront the feeling that's blocking the conversation, you'll never get to the conversation. So Lawrence has to work on, how do I lean into uncertainty? How can I feel it in my body and have a willingness to lean into that? JP asked, what emotion makes you run? JP, that's usually fear, I'd say. Fear is the most common one there. Okay, great. So thanks for the engagement. So here you can see what keeps you knowing that something needs to change but not doing anything about it is conflict avoidance and experiential avoidance. A lot of avoidance, right? Now, If you do decide to do something about it, you then need to start preparing and planning. But many people get stuck in this phase. They're planning endlessly. And there are two things that can cause this endless planning, this cycle where you get stuck on a merry-go-round and you're never moving forward and taking action, like making the first step. One is perfectionism. This is when you have an unrealistically high standard for yourself, and there's usually a bit of self-critical evaluation and fear of failure that's underlying that. Liesel made a good point here. She said, I do not want to make the other person feel bad. So in that, see, Liesel has a belief there. I don't want to make the other person feel bad. Maybe not her. I think she was mentioning just in general. But if someone has a feeling, I do not want to make the other person feel bad, they might have a perfectionistic standard for performance conversations. Because their standard might be that in this conversation, the other person needs to totally receive the feedback without any hassle, without any tension, without any self-doubt, and then that will mean that the conversation went according to plan. And that might be a perfectionistic standard because it might be unrealistically high. It might be reasonable to expect some emotions to come up in the conversation, and that's okay. So you have to inspect your idea of what is the perfect performance conversation. Many managers might have an idea about what performance conversations should look like, and that idea might be perfectionistic. So be wary of if that's you, because it'll keep you planning and trying to get ready to have the perfect conversation because you have the perfect idea of what it should be. And then you get stuck in the preparation phase. You never take action. And this happens all the time in our lives. The other thing that gets you stuck here is self-efficacy. So self-efficacy is your belief in your ability to do something. It's different from self-esteem. Self-esteem is your general evaluation about yourself. In general, I'm good or I'm bad or I'm so-so. That's self-esteem. Self-efficacy is about how good am I at chess? How good am I at running? Now, these self-efficacy beliefs, your belief in your ability to do something, in this case, a performance conversation, that belief will affect whether you even try or not, whether you take action. Lauren said there's a difference between won't do it versus can't do it. But what I want to add there is that sometimes it's not even just the case that you can't do it. Sometimes it's the case that you believe you can't do it. And whether you can't do it or whether you believe you can't do it, it leads to the same outcome, which is inaction. There are many things that many of you right now will believe you can't do that you actually can with really good practice and perseverance and growth and learning. So self-efficacy, your belief in your ability to have a good performance conversation, can sometimes cause inaction. It gets you stuck in just preparing but never engaging the action because deep down you don't think you can do it, right? Okay, so we're getting to the second last phase here, which is action. Now, this is where in this phase you've taken action at least once. You've done something, you've had a performance conversation, but you're not doing it consistently. You're not doing it regularly. You haven't moved to the next phase, the maintenance, where it's da da da. There's a rhythm and there's a word for that, a tempo to these performance conversations. So psychologically, what could explain that? One is emotion dysregulation. This is where emotion dysregulation is when you have a difficulty with turning up or down certain emotional responses in a flexible and effective way. Many of us struggle with this, and many of us have had bad experiences with performance conversations. Can you please indicate in the chat bar, has anyone had a bad experience with performance conversations? Please let me know. Has a performance conversation ever gone badly, either as a subordinate or a manager? Or have you ever seen a performance conversation go badly? You can just indicate a yes. If that's never happened to you, you've never had a bad performance conversation as a subordinate or as a manager, and you've never seen one either, you can say no in the chat bar. So please indicate now whether that's happened to you or not. Okay, Dumasani says yes. Craig says, when I was younger, I struggled with this. Emotion dysregulation went badly. Okay, yeah, Craig, and actually it's normal when you're younger because your prefrontal cortex, which regulates your emotions, only fully develops at the age of 25. So, maybe technically people should only be driving and drinking alcohol and voting at the age of 25. Interesting debate, but yeah, side point. Cherie says yes when the oh, I skipped that. Cherie says yes when the LM didn't prepare enough. Okay, great. Lawrence says never had a good one. Okay, Lawrence, I appreciate your honesty there. Vivian says yes. Liesel says I haven't heard so many stories in our leadership program about delegates having experienced horrible performance conversations. Oh, you have heard. Oh, okay, yeah, right. JP says I delegated. Nice, JP. Craig says, lol, by younger, went on into my 30s and early 40s. Slow learner. Okay. Okay, I see, Craig. Okay, great. So look at how relatable this is. Now, what happens is every experience that you've mentioned here is embedded in your memory. That's the only reason you could bring it up now. There's a part of your mind in which this memory is embedded. There are neurons right now, when I asked the question, that fired and activated, that are physically in your brain storing that memory. The problem here is that once you have that memory embedded into your brain, it starts to act as a little brake pedal. Oh, maybe I shouldn't go back there. I had a bad experience. I should avoid it in the future. This is a small scale version of PTSD. Because in PTSD, if I'm treating a war veteran, they've had an extremely traumatic memory, a person being blown to smithereens or something like that, a colleague of theirs. And then that memory keeps coming up and it makes them avoid life and avoid situations. But it can also happen on a smaller scale where you have a difficult conversation, an emotional conversation, and then you have the same kind of avoidance that's found in someone who has PTSD. So this causes a lack of consistency and maintenance, where you've taken action once, but once bitten, twice shy. Okay. Charisse asks, how much of this is also attributed to circumstantial factors that come into play? Example, too many direct reports, vacancies, forcing the LM to dip down. Some employees take advantage of this and gaslight because their manager is so busy being busy. Charisse, there's a lot of that, and I think a lot of that falls into structural issues as well, which is why Craig at the beginning of the presentation said that we're interested in both structure and agency. So this is just the agency part, but absolutely you need to tack on a lot of those structural issues onto this. And then the other thing that the other psychological process that can cause you to get stuck in taking action once or twice but not being consistent is self-criticism. Who here is harder on themselves than other people? Just let me know in the chat bar. Anyone here harder on themselves than other people? Like your friend can do something wrong and you'll be supportive, but if you do it wrong, it's, oh, you idiot. How could you have done that? Cherie says guilty. I'm also guilty. Definitely. Richard Taylor says me. Okay, great. Now, self-criticism stops you from being consistent because you are so evaluative on yourself about how you dealt with the poor performance. So you're beating yourself up. Oh, I made that person feel bad. Oh, I shouldn't have done that. What's wrong with me? If this internal narrative is going on, you're not going to be consistent. You're swimming upstream in terms of being consistent with that conversation because you've got this inner critic constantly beating you up about how the last time went. So what you need here is self-compassion exercises. This is where you need to say, if my friend handled the situation like I did, what would I say to my friend? I'd probably say something like, oh, don't worry, like these performance conversations are hard and it's a skill that can be built over time and you'll do better next time. If you'd say stuff like that to your friend, say it to yourself. Why aren't you treating yourself like a friend? You should be a friend to yourself, right? Craig says kind of hard on everyone, including myself. Oh, okay, interesting, Craig. Yeah, sometimes that happens. Sometimes, and that's when that happens, you have a critic that's an inner critic, but also an outer critic. That definitely does happen. Liesel says more so in certain circumstances where I should know better. Yeah. So Liesel, for you, it would be good to think, if a friend should have known better, what would you say to them? Would you be like, should have known better, you idiot? Or would you say something like, sometimes we can fail at things that are common. The fact that we bite our tongues sometimes when we're eating is evidence that we can mess up something where we should have known better, where we've been doing it for decades. The fact that you can still sometimes bite your tongue. I did it last month, I bit my tongue. It's something I should know better with, but it happens, right? That's self-compassion. And then just to hop through this last phase, now let's say you're being consistent with the performance conversations. You've got over the self-criticism, you've got over the emotion dysregulation, you're being consistent with it. There can still be a problem here where you're doing it consistently, but you haven't embodied it. It's not part of your identity yet. You're having to put in a lot of effort each time you do it. You are engaging the behavior, but you don't feel like the kind of person who can have these conversations in a productive way. This is where imposter phenomenon comes up. This is the same as imposter syndrome. We just call it phenomenon because there's a problem with calling it a syndrome, because it's not actually just about the individual. It's not like a disorder that the individual has. There's a lot of social factors here. That's why it's actually should be called imposter phenomenon, not imposter syndrome. But this is where you have this persistent belief that your success is undeserved. And that you're going to be found out. People are going to know you're a phony. And so many managers, they do have the performance conversations regularly, but they're feeling, I wonder how long I can pretend to be a competent manager. They haven't internalized it into their identity. And the other psychological process here is similar to imposter phenomenon, but it can be any self-limiting belief, which is a belief about yourself, the world, or other people that keeps you stuck. And this could be something like, I'm giving feedback regularly, but I don't think I'll ever be able to do this naturally. That's a belief. And that's not necessarily the truth. You might be able to do it naturally. So having this belief that you're just not someone who can be a competent manager can cause you to have to put effort into the behavior each time instead of realizing that you have actually been doing well. And some useful things to do here is attribution retraining and the downward arrow technique. So if you don't know what those are, quick Google search will help you out there. I can't get into depth. These are very complex clinical techniques, but attribution retraining, downward arrow technique, very helpful if you're in this maintenance phase and you finally want to move into termination. So in summary, I've downloaded a lot onto you right now, but I just wanted to give you some ideas about how what you said fits into specific stages of change and how you can move from pre-contemplation finally beyond maintenance and into termination in dealing with performance conversations more effectively when it's your own psychology that's getting in the way.
Nevern, that was brilliant. Thank you so much. And yes, it was a lot, but I liked the pace and the way it came through. Now, normally we'd put you back into groups, everybody, to go and process this. But today you could already sense that the format is slightly different to usual. And I'd like to just ask if anybody is got a question or a follow-on question or a comment. How is this landing for you? You know, what I notice is just how many possible internal obstacles there might be to dealing with poor performance. And so I've got a little bit more compassion now. If I think about a manager out there who's not dealing with poor performance in their units, I've got a bit more empathy. But I also have this idea that there are interventions, that there are skills that we could be giving managers to say, these are tools and techniques that you're going to need to use to help you be better at this. I'm curious about how many of you are using any of these tools and techniques in corporate settings to help equip managers to be better at dealing with poor performance, or are we all just either, you know, as Lauren said, ignoring the managers who are poor at poor performance? What's coming up for you? Lawrence, you're normally, I can see you're unmuted and you're ready to go. So if that's true, let me bring you in and then we'll see where that conversation takes us.
Thanks, Craig. I think I've said it in previous sessions as well. The best leadership development that I've ever was part of and was actually sending some of those leaders, the ones that's willing, to a good psychologist for counseling and therapy, to really work with their own demons, their own dark side, their own challenges, their own fears. And once they've basically gone through similar process to this, or same process, I'm not sure, I wasn't privy to the content, they came back and they were much better equipped to actually deal with it. But it extends also in this. Also, I had a part-time practice at some point where you deal with parents and you go with the same parenting and discipline and poor performance, or dealing with troubled children, the same process. And it's often people know this or know it, but know how to, but they just need that guidance to actually do this, to how to be a good parent, how to be a good leader. And to link those two, we've often in our leadership training, what I was involved was to say to leaders, if you're a good parent, you most probably will also be a good leader or a good manager. But if you're a bad manager, I can probably go and check on your children, then there's also problems. No, so, but this reflects very well.
Thank you, Lawrence. Any other thoughts? Anything bubbling up for anybody else? Dumasani's got a question in the chat box, Nevern. I don't know if you noticed that.
I did. He said, what is the role, responsibility, and accountability of the individual, which is the poor performer, as well as the context in all of this? Craig, would you like me to take a swing at that?
Yeah, I've got something to say on it, but I think we're all enjoying your voice. So, you take a kick and then I'll catch it if I feel like I need to.
Okay, perfect. So my understanding is that if there's poor performance, there would always be causal factors that lie within the poor performer, causal factors that lie within the manager, causal factors that lie within the context in which this thing is happening, and also causal factors that sometimes lie interpersonally. So there's intrapsychic factors in both the poor performer and the manager. There's interpersonal factors between them, and then there's the context in which this conversation is happening. That's the material context, the technological context, the social context, the organizational context, the cultural milieu. There's so many things. So causality in terms of what's causing poor performance and what's getting in the way of dealing with it is extremely complicated, as is any other human phenomenon. So I think, Dumasani, where it fits in is that everything you've mentioned will be its own cluster of causal factors. So interpersonal and contextual will also be there, and intrapsychic within the poor performer. This just so happens to be the bubble within the causality that lies within the manager, and what the manager can do about it from their side.
What I would add to that, Nevern and Dumasani and colleagues on the call, is only one person is getting paid to take responsibility for performance, and that's the manager. And I really want to, again, if you've been following WorldView for a while, we've been having a lot of these sessions focusing on bringing back respect for management roles. And with that respect for managerial roles comes the responsibilities that are managerial. You don't need to be a leader to deal with poor performance. You are expected as a manager to deal with poor performance. You're expected to do it. If you do it in a high quality way, we might say you're a great leader. But there is a fundamental expectation that managers should make sure that the performance of their unit, their team, their group is good and growing, and that the individuals, there's some duty of care. There's a duty to be careful of the lives and the performers in your team. So yes, we could have a whole other conversation about if you find out that you're performing poorly, why do you need a manager to point that out to you? That's a different conversation. But the manager is expected to deal with it. That's the responsibility, at least in my opinion. Thanks, Jimmy. Any other thoughts, comments, different takes on this?
Craig, if
If
I
not,
may,
yes,
sorry, it's
Lawrence.
just it's not really something new, but it's going back to some of our previous conversations or sessions, and it's directly about the role of management and leadership, or supervisors, managers, leadership, whatever you want to call it, you want to cluster it together, and that is for them to understand, if you want to assume that role, then it's some of them are still functional. Obviously, there's functional work that needs to be done. But the purpose of a leader or a manager is to ensure an environment and a team that can actually deliver. And that means also it's not just the good news. It's not just the cookies and the Worsbraai on a Friday afternoon and the kumbaya spirit. It's also dealing with the poor performance in the team to make sure that whoever is keeping the team back is either developed, trained, brought up to speed, or oftentimes we found is replaced, or not replaced, is placed in a different position where he or she is then found to be much more functional, much more successful in doing. And actually, I've got good examples of somebody that was a training manager, and he just was a disaster. And we eventually trained him and took him off the training program, voluntary. He said he wanted to do something else, and we developed him as an operator, and eventually became a foreman in a factory, and he excelled. I mean, he was really one of the better foremen that we've ever had in that area. So that's the role of a leadership, and I think we can go back and have more sessions about leadership and managers. But that's the role.
Thank you, Lawrence. And I would extend that, at a push to say, back to Jim Yasani's question about the context. Great managers deal with the contextual issues as well. If there are genuinely structural constraints around performance, they go and have meetings with their peers and their bosses to resolve any of the structural issues. Charisse talks about incompatibility, which is tricky. That could be relational or role incompatibility. And I think, Lawrence, you just put your finger on it. So if you've got somebody who's just not fit for the job, move them, find another job that they are fit for. I'm going to do one more invitation for any other thoughts or comments.
I think you should give Charisse a chance. The stuff she's writing in the chat is bringing up lots of interesting topics there.
Use your words, Charisse, if you'd like. Just you can be our last contributor.
Thank you, Liesel.
Sorry.
No, it's just I've had so many cases where, I mean, for a line manager, it's really like it's not a nice part of the job, but it's part of the job. So you are getting paid to do it. And I mean, from an HR perspective, I found the hand-holding, like, it's definitely one of those areas where you have to handhold support. What I found is also helping them, with preparation as well, putting a sequence of events, evidence pack together, like start from when you start seeing performance issues starting to sprout its head. You would have your monthly engagements, your performance evaluation on an annual basis, whatnot, and that's your evidence. You start building from that, and sometimes they don't even know that they're doing it unconsciously anyway. And you just have to point that out to them. And at the end of the day, it's confidence as well in what they've observed, what they've done. And yeah, just EQ is so important. They need to understand their triggers. I mean, also working in a unionized environment where the union likes to scratch a bit to see where, line managers, especially those with short fuses, where they can actually play on those emotions that come up. But what I've explained as well in those situations is, as long as you are performing your role, you've done everything in your power to help capacitate this person. You've done everything within the constraints of whatever policies are in place and all of that, short of actually performing the job for the person. That's where you are. And I think from a CCMA perspective, if you can prove that you would quite comfortably be able to win that case.
Cherise, thank you. I think that's
experience.
a beautiful wrap, because for me, there's also the invitation that you're putting out there, which is to help managers completely reframe that feeling. You know, a manager who thinks that the dealing with poor performance is a shitty part of the job, if they can reframe that as the most valuable part of the job that they will ever have, that it's the most positive work that a manager can do is to help somebody else improve, either by relocating or by skilling or by, you know, to deal with that poor performance and see it as one of the nicest possible parts of their job. It's their opportunity in life to help others. And you don't help people who are performing well, for heaven's sake. You just celebrate that. You help people who are struggling. And for managers to really, really identify with that, I think is helpful. I know it's slightly paternalistic, and we keep making this parent metaphor. Like a parent, you want to help your children, we hope, and a great manager will always try to help, particularly the poor performers. Nevern, I'm going to invite you to wrap, and then I'm going to close out the call after that. Nevern, you get your final word in.
Yeah, I love what you're saying there, Craig, about how meaningful this work can be. I just want to reassure everyone, just as a closing note, that if the main concern is upsetting someone or hurting someone's feelings, it is going to happen to some degree. So our brain actually interprets social rejection, criticism, and feedback through the same neural pathways as physical pain. You should look into the neuroscience of that. It's the same brain regions that get activated when we're criticized versus if we've been physically burned. So it's probably going to happen to some degree. Just so you know, it's normal for these feelings to come up. I'm just mentioning this because I saw it was a common thread about not wanting to hurt someone or the discomfort of being a bad person. You know, it is going to happen. I did a lecture on how to handle feedback effectively, because most people don't anyways, and that's their responsibility to also learn how to absorb feedback. But yeah, in closing, just to say, it is possible to change many of these things. These are processes. These are not fixed traits. So it is possible to work on all of these processes, and I'd encourage people to look into the techniques on how to do that.
Thank you, Nevern, and thank you to everybody that was on the call. Invitation quickly to next month's Café. We are changing gears slightly and going to go and look at this idea of agility, organizational agility, agile. Organizational agility is not what you think. And we're going to really stand on Chris Worley's stuff here. So if anybody's, you know, a Chris Worley fan or don't know who Chris Worley is, you can go and look him up. Many organizations claim today that they want to be agile, but few understand what that really means. And organizational development has been thinking about this for quite a long time, and there is some conversation we can have. I think particularly for large corporate setups, agility is a dream, you know, for those administrative machines. How do they even contemplate agility? And for smaller firms trying to be agile, they often fall over themselves. So what does good agile look like? Lisa will be leading us through that one. And you're all welcome to bring a friend. Nevern, as ever, thank you. And thank you to everyone who managed to stay on and get through the 10 o'clock drop-off. Really appreciate that. Follow us on LinkedIn, subscribe to our newsletter, comment on our posts, and send work our way. We've still got a bit of space for more projects this year, so one or two of you might get lucky and get to work with us. Thank you, everybody. Thank you all. Fantastic call.